from Bethany.
Yeah, that's what Abby said.
Yeah.
Oh, serious?
Yeah.
That's what Abby said.
Sam, we're waiting on Crawford still.
For who?
Crawford and his the highway bill.
Now that Mr. Crawford has graced us with his attendance, we will be able to start.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I have an amendment in nature.
Let me call it. All right, I'll call the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, House Rule 11, Clause 2, H4, the chairman may postpone further proceedings today on any question approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays are ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's meeting without objection that is so ordered. A bill and amendment text has been distributed electronically and paper copies are available here in the hearing room. Finally, I ask unanimous consent for the committee to use amendments roster for any item under consideration by the committee, and without objection, that is so ordered. Today, the committee is considering 15 measures. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3209, which is the I-70 Numbering Act of 2023. An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5903 to authorize the International Boundary and Water Commission to accept funds for activities relating to wastewater treatment and flood control works and for other purposes. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1586, Forest Protection Wildlife Firefighter Safety Act 2023. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5473, Promoting Resilient Buildings Act of 2023, H.R. 6277, the FASTA Reform Act 2023, H.R. 6278, Maximizing Office Value and Efficiency Act 2023, amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6260, Federal Oversight of Construction Use and Safety Act, amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6276, Utilizing Space Efficiently in Improving Technologies Act 2023, H.R. 6261, Impact of Crime on Public Buildings Usage Act 2023, H.R. 6241, Federal Use It or Lose It Leases Act, H.R. 6249, Think Differently About Emergencies Act, H.R. 6254, Public Buildings Accountability Act 2023, H.R. 5754 to designate the United States Courthouse located in Los Angeles, California as the Felicitas and Gonzalo Mendez United States Courthouse. H.R. 6316 to amend Title 40 United States Code to establish an expiration date of certain committee resolutions with respect to leases or projects and for other purposes. And H.R. 6317 to require the administrator of the General Services Administration to submit a report describing a process for seeking public comment about proposed changes to mandatory design standards for public buildings and other purposes. I want to keep the hearing moving. We are going to probably have votes somewhere in between that is going to interfere. We are going to roll the votes to the end so we all don't have to worry about trying to be here all the time. I know we've got other markups that are going on in the halls today. And with that, our first item of consideration is H.R. 3209, the I-27 Numbering Act of 2023. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Highways and Transit from further consideration of H.R. 3209. And without objection, that is so ordered. And now I'll call upon the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read, open for amendment at any point. And I recognize Highway and Transit Subcommittee Chairman Crawford to offer his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3209, offered by Mr. Crawford of Arkansas.
Without objection, the amendment to the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for the purposes of further amendment. And I recognize Mr. Crawford for 5 minutes for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to offer and support the amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 3209, the I-27 Numbering Act of 2023, originally introduced by Mr. Arrington of Texas. Senators Cruz and Cornyn championed companion legislation that passed under unanimous consent in the Senate. This bipartisan legislation officially designates segments of the Ports to Plains corridor in Texas as Interstate Route 27 or I-27. Last Congress, the fiscal year 2022 appropriations bill marked segments of the corridor in New Mexico and Texas as a future federal interstate. This legislation builds on that success by designating the Texas portion of the route as I-27. The Ports to Plains corridor spans from the United States-Mexico border in Texas through our country's heartland to Alberta, Canada, and serves as a crucial infrastructure asset for American agricultural and energy accessibility. This designation will benefit farmers, ranchers, and producers across Texas and the country to help boost our trade economy. Specifically with this designation, Laredo stands to become the only port of entry in our nation with 4 interstate corridors, which will subsequently expand our gross domestic product and provide quality employment opportunities for thousands of Americans. I urge my colleagues to support both the amendment in the nature of a substitute and the underlying bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Now recognize Mr. Larson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support this legislation, which is a bipartisan effort to designate portions of the Ports to Plains corridor within Texas as the future Interstate 27. The amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporates technical assistance from the Federal Highway Administration, which prevents duplicative route numbering from being used on different roadway spurs. This change will make the designation clearer for travelers. Similar bipartisan legislation passed the Senate by unanimous consent earlier this year, and I support the measure's passage today. With that, I yield back.
Now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I am happy to support H.R. 3209, amendment in the nature of a substitute, the I-27 Numbering Act, which is a bipartisan bill originally introduced by my colleague from Texas, Mr. Arrington. With that, I'd urge my colleagues to support the bill, and now recognize Highway and Transit Subcommittee Ranking Member Norton for a statement. No statement. Thank you. Seeing no further speakers, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3209? Seeing none, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3209. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reported of H.R. 3209 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered reported favorably to the House. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is now laid upon the table. Our Our next item for consideration is H.R. 5903 to authorize the International Boundary and Water Commission to accept funds for activities related to wastewater treatment and flood control works and other purposes. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Water Resources and the Environment from further consideration of H.R. 5903, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call upon the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Water and Resources Environment Subcommittee Ranking Member Napolitano to offer her. Mr. Larson to offer the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Should I have an amendment in the nature of substitute at the desk?
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5903, offered by Ms. Napolitano of California.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as the base text for further amendment. I now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is one example where a member has a markup in another committee. So Mr. Napolitano's over Natural Resources asked me to speak on this behalf, and certainly strongly support this bipartisan effort by the leadership of the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment to assist the U.S. section of the International Boundary and Water Commission to carry out its critical water-related missions. This bill and a complementary amendment in the nature of a substitute fulfills a budgetary request from the administration to provide the IBWC with contributed funds authority. This authority, which most of the other federal infrastructure agencies already possess, will allow the IBWC to partner with other federal agencies and non-federal interests to carry out critical water-related projects, including projects for wastewater treatment, water conservation, and flood control. The amendment in the nature of a substitute includes 2 changes to the underlying bill. First, the amendment limits the amount of contributed funds that would be subject to credit or reimbursement to $5 million annually. And second, the amendment includes a reporting requirement to this committee on IBWC's use of this new contributed funds authority. I want to commend the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Napolitano, for introducing this critical legislation to help the IBWC complete its mission. And I also want to commend the chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Rouser, for his strong support. I support the amendment in the nature of substitute and recommend that members support the amendment as well. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Rouser.
I thank the chairman. I'm pleased to have worked on this legislation with Ranking Member Napolitano, which would allow the IBWC to accept funding from other federal agencies as well as non-federal entities such as cities and state agencies for water infrastructure projects. The legislation will have a very tangible and positive impact on the operations of the IBWC. The Commission has an expansive water infrastructure portfolio that includes 500 miles of levees, 20,000 acres of floodplains, 2 international storage dams and hydroelectric power plants, as well as 2 international wastewater treatment plants. Earlier this year, Dr. Heenair, Commissioner of the IBWC, testified before the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee, saying that the Commission has a $473 million maintenance backlog. This legislation will help the Commission tackle this maintenance backlog and meet other infrastructure needs as they arise. I want to thank my colleague, Ranking Member Napolitano, again for her efforts on this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the substitute to H.R. 5903 as well as the underlying bill. I yield back.
I'd recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement. I am happy to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5903 offered by Water Resources Committee, Environment Subcommittee Ranking Member Napolitano. This bill is obviously going to give the IBWC another tool to help address water infrastructure issues in its service area. I'd urge my colleagues to support the bill. And seeing no further speakers, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5903? Hearing none, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5903. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 5903 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. Nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Moving on, I do want to recognize really quick that my district staff is in the audience. They're getting a crash course on markups here in the way we do it, at least in the Transportation Committee, and I welcome them to the Transportation Committee hearing room. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 1586, the Forest Protection and Wildlife Firefighter Safety Act. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge to the Subcommittee on Water Resources and the Environment from further consideration of H.R. 1586, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now under consideration as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. LaMaffa to offer his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your help and your allowing this to be in your hearing here today. Worked very hard on this. I also want to thank Chairman Westerman for the help over in the Natural Resources Committee as well, and for my co-lead on this amendment, Rep. Hoyle. Appreciate her help, and my co-lead on the bill in chief, Mr. Panetta from California. So a lot of great help on this for really a common sense fix.
Let's designate real quick. Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1586, offered by Mr. LaMalfa of California.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as a base text for the purposes of further amendment. Mr. LaMalfa, please continue.
Thank you, sir. This gives basic relief to a problem that really shouldn't have happened. A lawsuit was drawn by an environmental group to basically try and block the use of aerial application of fire retardant, which is very critical on western wildfires. We've seen a dramatic increase in wildfires across the West. Just the 5th anniversary of the Camp Fire in Paradise the other day, the deadliest fire in California's history, and then the Dixie Fire in 2021, which is the largest single-source wildfire in California history, over about 1 million acres. Partly due to our mismanagement of our forests, which we must address at another time, this bill is a strong short-term solution to prevent these wildfires. Indeed, a lawsuit was brought to stop the use of the discharge aerially of fire retardant because of a perceived threat it might be into navigable waters of the U.S., because it doesn't have currently a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NEPDAS permit, and so they claim that's in violation of the Clean Water Act. Now, federal, state, and local fire agencies did not need such a permit, as they did not believe it was required due to fire suppression being a classification as an exempt silvicultural activity, a policy which has stood since at least 1993, 30 years or longer. The Forest Service has begun the process of obtaining the permit from the EPA and the 47 states who authorize their own Section 402 Clean Water Act permits. The process is estimated to take at least 2.5 years, possibly more. The environmental group wanted to prevent the Forest Service from using the fire retardant until they obtain a permit. But with a 2.5-year timeline, we found that unacceptable with the way wildfires are ravaging, especially in the West. If an injunction were to have been made, our firefighters' jobs would be in greater danger, civilians' lives and property would be at greater risk, and more of our public lands and forests would be up in smoke than already. Fortunately, the judge in this case recognized these dangers and specifically rejected the request for an injunction. As the EPA told this committee in June, the Forest Service has entered into a federal facility compliance agreement, which allows for the continued aerial deployment of fire retardant until a final permit is acquired. That being said, my bill, as amended by the amendment nature substitute, will provide much needed certainty to the Forest Service and every other firefighting agency. The safe harbor included in this amendment will prevent the status quo for wildfire retardant from being shifted again until the EPA and the states finish developing the relevant CWA permits. When fighting wildfires, retardant is among the most vital tools used to decrease fire intensity, cool the ground, and slow the advance of fire. Retardant can help to hold the line in one area, helping buy viable time, while firefighters focus on other areas of the fire that often stretch across tens of thousands of acres. There's no workable alternative to this fire retardant. So Forest Service Chief Randy Moore testified to that effect in House Ag Committee earlier this year. Simply put, we need to guarantee the use of all and best available tools for our wildland firefighters. I'm grateful for the support from many members of the Congress and thank the committee here for the effort on this bill in a bipartisan manner. So I urge my colleagues to support, and thank you for your time and support, and I yield back.
Now recognize Mr. Larson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I support the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Representative LaMalfa. This amendment does two things. It preserves the ability of firefighters to utilize critical aerial supplements to ensure the safety of our citizens, firefighters, and communities. Secondly, and equally as important, it brings the aerial application of approved fire suppressants under the regulatory protections of the Clean Water Act, ensuring the mindful use of these chemicals near our water bodies to aid in the protection of waterways and water-related environment. Several federal agencies expressed opposition to the underlying bill as inconsistent with both the goals of the Clean Water Act and the ongoing efforts by the U.S. EPA and Forest Service to develop a common-sense general permit structure for safe and continued use of aerial fire suppressants. That general permit structure, which is modeled on a decades-old successful general permit for application of pesticides to ag lands, should be completed within the next 2 years. The amendment in the nature of substitute reinforces the current legal protections provided by a federal district court, ensures no approved federal, state, local, or tribal agency or contractors can be barred from the continued use of approved fire suppressants while the aerial fire suppressant general permit is being finalized. Once that's completed, future use of aerial fire suppressants would be governed by the terms of that permit. And I want to thank the majority for working in a bipartisan manner on this ANS, and I want to thank Mr. LaMalfa, Representative LaMalfa and Representative Hoyle for their work here in the committee to support the ANS and recommend members do the same. That I yield back.
Mr. Rouser, 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Wildfires have caused much damage and loss over the past few years, so it's obvious we need to utilize every tool at our disposal to fight these fires. Anything less, quite frankly, is irresponsible and dangerous. Given this, I find it stunning there are some groups that would use the justice system to stop the use of all available tools to fight these fires. The Forest Protection and Wildland Firefighter Safety Act puts common sense back in play, ensuring crucial firefighting materials are available to fight these wildfires by blocking frivolous legal action that prevents their use. So I appreciate the hard work of the gentleman and my friend from California, Mr. LaMalfa, to move this legislation forward, as well as those on the other side of the aisle who have worked with us on this. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back.
I now recognize my good friend, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. LaMalfa, thank you for the bill. Necessary that we do this. You and I know wildfires in our districts, in our home areas, and we do know that these aerial applications of these firefighting foams does work. We also know that a permit may be required, but we ought not stop using these while we move forward on obtaining the necessary national permit. And along the way, we're always looking for a less toxic, better material to be used in these applications. That's also underway. This bill, this amendment is necessary. We cannot delay, we cannot stop using these materials to fight fires while we pursue a national permit. Therefore, I support the legislation. There are plenty of people that want to sue on most everything. This is not a good place to sue. If you want to increase the pollution of our streams and rivers, then let the fires rage. You'll have far more pollution than you would ever have from this particular foam, which may not pollute at all. Therefore, I support the amendment. Ask for everyone to do so.
Are there any other speakers? Seeing none, I am pleased to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1586 offered by Mr. LaMalfa. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1586? Hearing none, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1586. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 1586 as amended to the House of Representatives. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably, reported to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 5473, the Promoting Resilient Buildings Act of 2023. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 5473. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Edwards to offer his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5473, offered by Mr. Edwards of North Carolina.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as the base text for purposes of further amendment. I recognize Mr. Edwards for 5 minutes for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Building codes regulate new construction and major renovations, setting minimum standards for homes and commercial structures to withstand natural disasters, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, or in the case of the mountain communities in North Carolina, flooding. In 2018, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act established the definition of building codes as they relate to hazard mitigation, to include the latest 2 published editions of relevant codes, specifications, and standards. This definition sunset in October. Left unresolved, FEMA can revert the definition to the single latest edition of codes. My bill, the Promoting Resilient Buildings Act of 2023, will codify the definition to mean the 2 latest published editions of building codes, which is expected to prevent significant administrative burdens on states and local municipalities responsible for producing hazard mitigation plans. Reduce the burdensome regulations on trade industries responsible for adapting their techniques to meet new standards and codes, and support stabilized building costs that would otherwise be interrupted by frequently changing building codes and rising construction costs. Using the latest 2 editions of building codes does not jeopardize resiliency, and it will continue to ensure our communities are prepared for disaster if it ever strikes. I ask that my colleagues consider supporting this bill, and I thank the chairman for giving me an opportunity to speak on the bill, which is important to home builders and community members alike.
I now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Although I have a couple amendments that I'll be introducing to this. ANS, I do support the legislation that Representatives Edwards and Norcross have put forward. 5473, let me be sure it's the right number. Yeah, 5473 provides FEMA with greater flexibility when incentivizing the use of hazard-resistant building codes in its pre-disaster mitigation programs, the BRIC program, or Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, and the Storm Revolving Loan program. Current law directs FEMA to only consider the latest edition of building codes when implementing pre-disaster mitigation programs. This legislation will allow FEMA to consider the 2 latest editions. The additional flexibility will help states and communities that are struggling to adapt to frequent changes in building codes. However, this flexibility should be coupled with reforms that give communities access to funding needed to adopt and enforce the updated editions of building codes. Building codes are proven to save taxpayer dollars. According to a study conducted by the National Institute of Building Sciences, every dollar invested in hazard-resistant building codes before a disaster saves an average of $11 of recovery costs. In the last Congress, I was pleased to support the House passage of the Resilient America Act. That act included some of the language that is also included in H.R. 5473 and includes a series of additional reforms to enhance nationwide resilience. Notably, the reforms would have created a guaranteed funding stream for the enforcement and adoption of hazard-resistant building codes, enabled FEMA to fund pre-disaster mitigation projects to make individual homes more resilient, and more than doubled the amount of money FEMA can investigate in disaster mitigation each year. I know this would have benefited the county of Whatcom County, where I live, where I represent, that experienced atmospheric river flooding in November 21 for approximately 23 to 24 straight days. In September, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that the U.S. has suffered from $23 billion worth of disasters this year. a new record. It's urgent that Congress support substantive and common sense reforms that expand disaster mitigation, save taxpayer dollars, and enhance public safety. I'm disappointed the bill we're considering is decoupled from Resilient America, the Resilient America Agreement, and more substantive reform, but certainly will support this adoption and encourage my colleagues to do the same. With that, I yield back.
Recognize myself. Real quick, H.R. 5473 cuts red tape and improves resiliency against disasters by making technical corrections to the Stafford Act, extending the building code definition from Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. I do urge support of this amendment in the nature of a substitute to the underlying bill. We now are considering amendments. Are there amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5473?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment.
Is Mr. Larson.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5473, offered by Ranking Member Larson of Washington, number 11.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Ranking Member Larson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 5473 would create a dedicated funding stream for the adoption and enforcement of hazard-resistant building codes with FEMA's Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, also known as BRIC. I filed this amendment because I believe it will meaningfully advance our national resilience strategy and help ensure public safety. Investment in hazard-resistant codes is a scientifically proven way to save money and protect communities. FEMA believes the adoption and implementation of resilient codes is the most effective mitigation measure a community can take. The agency reported that nationwide adoption of modern codes would result in $600 billion of savings from disaster impact, would result in that savings by 2060. Implementation of stronger codes helps local governments and homeowners alike since they reduce insurance premiums and post-disaster financial exposure. A recent study by CoreLogic and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety found that modern codes reduce the likelihood of mortgage default following extreme weather by about 50%. 65% of counties, cities, and towns across the U.S. have not adopted modernized building codes. We can provide the resources for these communities to do just that. Last Congress as well, this committee passed the Resilient America Act, which included not only the language in the underlying bill, but also this amendment. So I would ask folks to support this. However, Chair, if I withdraw this amendment, can you commit to me today that we'll work on this language in the future so it can be included in a bipartisan reintroduction of the Resilient America Act this Congress?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we can find a bipartisan, so I'm sure we can.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely committed to working with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. With that, I withdraw the amendment. I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? And I believe you're speaking for Ms. Titus?
I will, yeah.
Mr. Larson, you have an amendment.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
Number 12.
Ms. Titus' amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5473, offered by Ranking Member Larson of Washington, number 12, revision 1.
Without objection, the amendment we consider as read. Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of Ms. Titus to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment offered by Ranking Member Titus. The amendment creates a pilot program to allow proactive mitigation investment for the purposes of making individual homes more resilient to disasters. Often homeowners cannot retrofit their homes with recommended mitigation measures because they are too expensive. This pilot program creates the first pre-disaster federal grant program that enables homeowners to take mitigation into their own hands for all hazards. Last year, I supported the language in this amendment along with 62 of my T&I colleagues when it was considered as part of the Resilient America package. It's a common sense pilot program that was reported out of markup and passed the House on suspension last Congress. With that, I support this amendment. I urge my colleagues to do the same. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I do support this amendment, and I very much appreciate Ms. Titus working with us to come to an agreement. And with that, I yield back. Are there any other speakers on this amendment? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment? And seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question now is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5473 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 5473 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes do have it. And H.R. 5473 as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. We are now going to stand in recess while we have a vote. I believe we have 17 approximately votes, and we will be back right after we finish with the last ones. The committee shall stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
Okay. And since Mr. Larson isn't here, Mrs. Napolitano will speak on each bill on his behalf.
We'll call the hearing back to order. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6277, the FASTA Reform Act of 2023, and I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 6277 without objection. That is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'd recognize myself for 5 minutes on this statement. I'd like to thank my colleague, Subcommittee Chairman Perry, for his work on H.R. 6277, the FAST Reform Act. H.R. 6277 makes improvements to the authorities of the Public Buildings Reform Board established by the Federal Asset Sale and Transfer Act of 2016 to increase the number of federal properties the board recommends to be sold or redeveloped. FASTA's intent is to reduce waste in the federal real estate portfolio and save taxpayers money, and this bill is going to help us better achieve the goals of that law. I urge support of the bill, and with that, yield back. And I now recognize Mr. Napolitano for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support H.R. 6277, which was introduced by Subcommittee Chairman Perry and co-sponsored by Subcommittee Ranking Member Titus. 6277 amends the Federal Asset Sale and Transfer Act, FASTA, of 2016. FASTA created a new and temporary 3-round process for reducing the federal government's inventory of unneeded and underutilized federal civilian real property. Unfortunately, the implementation of FASTA was challenging from the very beginning. 2 of the properties in the Haverty round still have not sold, and OMB rejected the board's first round recommendations. Because the board lacked a quorum at that time, they were unable to resubmit the list of recommendations to OMB. While the board is currently working on the second and final round, the board members asked Perry, Chairman Perry, and Ranking Member Titus to amend the statute to increase the chances that the last round would be successful. Some of the improvements requested by the board, which are included in H.R. 6277, are required. Federal agents to share their real property data and consolidation plans with the board, authority to prepare properties for disposal, and identify the highest and best use of the property after disposition, the ability to submit recommendations to OMB on a rolling basis and extend the program through 2026. Disposing of federal real property is difficult. In fact, property disposal has been on CAO's high-risk list for about 20 years. H.R. 6277 will give the board tools and time to get the job done. I thank Chairman Perry and Ranking Member Titus for introducing 6277. I urge its adoption. Yield back.
Seeing no more speakers, we're now moving on to amendments. For work purposes, Mr. Garamendi, seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment to H.R. 6277 offered by Mr. Garamendi of California, number 156.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. And Mr. Garamendi, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would suppose that all of us would want to know in advance if the GSA or any federal agency wants to close one of their buildings in our district. Maybe we think it's a good idea, maybe we think it's not a good idea, but we really don't know until it's way, way down the road. This amendment is simply an effort for us to try to at least regain a little bit of our power and forcing the federal agencies to notify us before they decide to close and sell a building in our district. For me, well, it's only 1,400 jobs that they decided shouldn't be in my district. They ought to shut down the building. And I'm going, guys, you could have let us know. We could maybe have found a way to work our way through this. Now, we're doing something similar over in the NDAA, that if there's a major military construction project that is anticipated in any of our districts, that we'd be notified before early in that process so that we might engage on a positive or negative side of it. But it's a pretty simple little amendment forcing the various federal agencies, particularly the GSA, to let us know ahead of time if they are looking to close a building in our district. That's it. Ask for an aye vote.
Do any other members wish to be recognized on the amendment? I recognize myself for 5 minutes, speak on the amendment. And unfortunately, I have to oppose the amendment. And while I understand the intent, completely understand the intent, this inserts a notification requirement in that process at a time that would be far too early and potentially creates concern about items that will never materialize. The law already requires that the board consult with state and local officials, make the proposals publicly available, and hold a public hearing to making a recommendation where, if it was approved by OMB, there is a congressional notification prior to disposal of the property. Again, I agree that members should be notified, but at a point in the process where it'd be most helpful to members, and I believe that it already exists. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time. Are there any other speakers? Seeing none, any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The opinion of the chair, the nays have it. Nays do have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other further amendments? Ms. Perry, would you like to say anything on your bill? Or do you want us to go ahead and move to vote?
Mr. Chairman, sorry to be late. Thank you. I want to thank the subcommittee and chairman for joining me in introducing the FASTA Reform Act. The Federal Assets Sale and Transfer Act was passed in 2016 to create a temporary board of experts to identify federal priorities for sale and redevelopment. Unfortunately, the process has not worked as originally envisioned. Agencies have been slow to produce needed information and data for the board to effectively review properties. The Federal Real Property Council has even refused to give the board access to its information in meetings. And we understand the Office of Management and Budget, which must sign off on the board recommendations, has not provided the board with the support it needs to be effective. This bill makes a number of reforms to improve the effectiveness of the process, including extending the board timeline, accelerating the effective date of incentives for agencies, and to put forward properties and giving the board access to the Federal Real Property Council. The bill also directs the board to send property sale recommendations to this committee. If OMB is not inclined to approve sales, that report will give members on this committee an opportunity to review the board's recommendations and determine if Congress should direct any sales through legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reported of H.R. 6277 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and reported favorably to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The next item for consideration is H.R. 6278, the Maximizing Office Value and Efficiency, or MOVE Act of 2023, and I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 6278. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I yield myself 5 minutes for a statement. I want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Scott Perry for his leadership on this bill and the issue overall. According to the GAO, only 9% of General Service Administration headquarters building is being utilized. Again, only 9%. And imagine if that were a private sector company, the cost to operate and maintain the facility would literally not be worth it. The bill would give GSA an opportunity to consolidate other agencies into its headquarters and dramatically improve the utilization of taxpayer-funded space or move out and sell it. And I'd urge support of the bill and would yield back. And I now recognize Ms. Napolitano for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 6278 directs GSA and OMB to identify two agencies to consolidate into GSA's DC headquarters building in order to produce utilization rate of not less than 60%. If GSA fails to identify the agencies and execute a consolidation plan within 3 years, then it must consolidate into another federally owned public building and prepare GSA headquarters building for sale. I understand the goal here. Federal buildings should be fully occupied and utilized, and GSA headquarters building is neither. GSA's 1800 F Street headquarters building is a 7-story, 764,000 gross square foot building, which was constructed in 1917 for the Department of Interior, which resided in the building until 1949, at which time it became the headquarters of GSA. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The building was partially renovated in 2000s. However, half of the building has never been renovated and would require an investment of potentially hundreds of millions of dollars to prepare it to receive two additional federal aid. Excuse me, I would be happy to work with the Chairman Perry to secure the funding for this idea and other GSA construction and leasing projects that have been submitted to this committee and upon which this committee is here to act. The committee has pending before it 43 GSA FY24 funding requests, none of which are included in this markup today. I hope in the future to be able to work in a majority to address GSA project and funding backlog. But without additional funding, this legislation places an unrealistic and unworkable mandate on GSA. We all know the federal office daily occupancy rates are lower, in part because many of the federal employees are using telework and alternative work schedules. In response, the majority has offered bills to fully the majority has offered bills to force federal agencies to reduce and consolidate office space. But simultaneously, the majority is also pushing for federal employees to be in the office for 5 days a week. Which is it? Do you want a smaller federal office space footprint, or do you want every federal employee in office 5 days a week? We probably could find some common goal and common ground for legislation if the overall goal has more consistency. For now, I must oppose 6278 and urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Mr. Perry.
Well, thank you, Chairman Graves. I'm proud to sponsor H.R. 6278, the MOVE Act. During our July subcommittee hearing, the Government Accountability Office revealed the General Service Administration itself is only using, as the chairman rightly pointed out, 9% of its headquarters building here in Washington, D.C. The GSA is charged with being the federal government's real estate expert, and it is supposed to be setting the standard for other federal agencies when it comes to space utilization and best practices. This bill would direct GSA to consolidate other agencies into its headquarters to meet at least a 60% utilization rate or move out and sell the building. I know my counterpart complains about the 5-day requirement, but that gets us to 60% utilization, which is, quite honestly, I think overly reasonable. But be that as it may, GSA is surrounded by other federal agencies, some of which have a similarly poor utilization rate, such as the Office of Personnel Management, which is also at 9% according to the GAO. There are a number of options GSA will likely have in terms of sharing space with other agencies. We also understand that GSA has been looking at consolidations and other uses in their building. So this bill would direct them to actually complete and implement such plans or move. And yesterday in testimony, GSA has actually said that they were in negotiations with other agencies. So ultimately, I suspect it may be easier to just direct GSA to move out and sell the building, but I wanted to provide GSA with an opportunity to stay if they're able to fill their headquarters. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield the balance.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Hearing none, are there any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question is now on the adoption favorably reporting of H.R. 6278 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without
As for recorded vote,
the gentlelady requests a recorded vote as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question are postponed. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6260, the Federal Oversight of Construction Use and Safety, or FOCUS Act of 2023. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management for further consideration of H.R. 6260. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize the gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Chavez DeReamer, to offer her amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of the substitute at the desk.
Clerk, designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6260, offered by Ms. Chavez DeReamer of Oregon.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize Ms. Chavez DeReamer for 5 minutes for her statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee are aware of the vastness of GSA's footprint and at the same time the extremely low office utilization rates. This is the case despite the administration's direction to the federal workforce to return to the office. A few of my colleagues attended a roundtable in March where we discussed in greater detail the vastness of GSA's real estate. Members may have different views on remote or versus in-person attendance, but we can work together to make some common sense reforms on how GSA manages thousands of assets and millions of square feet across the country. This bill's reform keeps costs down, reduces waste, encourages interagency cooperation, and improves reporting to Congress. I am grateful for incorporating a suggestion from the other side of the aisle, Section 7, regarding reporting requirements. And with that, I'll yield back.
Without objection. I now recognize Ms. Napolitano for her statement.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 6260, the Federal Oversight of Construction Use and Safety Act, FOCUS Act, introduced by Ms. Chavez DeReamer, is substantive, good faith effort at reducing the cost of General Service Administration's capital project. The bill requires GSA to notify the committee when a construction or renovation project that we authorize increases or decreases by 5%. It requires GSA to submit an amended prospectus to this committee if a project increases or decreases by more than 10%. The focus requires GSA to collect data from tenants about safety incidents in and around public buildings and submit that data to the subcommittee. The bill requires GSA to include utilization and occupancy in data in prospectus submitted to this committee. It requires the Government Accountability Office, GAO, to review the use of special space, such as fitness centers and conference centers in federal buildings. In addition, the bill requires GSA to share location information between federal agencies in the same geographic area to facilitate opportunities for space sharing and consolidations. The amendment is the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6260, which we are considering, contains a new section drafted by Democrat staff, which requires GSA to notify the committee when project milestones are accomplished, such as the solicitation award of design services, the completion of actions required under the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, and when the project is completed. While I support the bill, I don't think it's perfect. I support the ANS to H.R. 6260, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Mr. Perry.
Well, thank you, Chairman Graves. I want to thank the gentlewoman from Oregon and Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, Ms. Chavez DeReamer, for her leadership on H.R. 6260, the FOCUS Act. H.R. 6260 focuses on strengthening oversight of federal buildings and improving the safety of federal workers at federal facilities. They should not have to be concerned for their safety because they work at a federal facility. The bill bolsters oversight and ensuring the committee is notified if the cost for authorized projects change by more than 5%, requiring GSA to include in its proposal for new projects more details on utilization rates and ensuring GSA's tenant agencies are informed about other agencies nearby to support co-locations. The bill also requires GSA to collect data and report on criminal activity that may be impacting public safety in and around public buildings. Finally, the bill directs GAO to conduct a review of special use space, such as conference centers and fitness centers. I urge my colleagues to support the ANS, and I yield the balance.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. And I want to thank the gentlelady from Oregon for her leadership on this measure, and I would urge support of the amendment in the nature of a substitute in the underlying bill. We are now considering amendments. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Perry, and your hearings, very, very useful, very helpful. Thank you for holding those hearings and for the legislation coming out of it, including this particular piece of legislation.
Present the
general
amendment.
thrust.
Well, let's designate it real quick.
That's a really good idea. Why don't we call up my amendment?
Clerk, designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6260, offered by Mr. Garamendi of California, number 151, revision 1.
Without objection, the amendment would be considered as read. Mr. Garamendi, please continue.
I think you did this just so I can get another shot at complimenting Mr. Perry, for which I will pay dearly in my district. Nevertheless, I could repeat it all, but he's on the right track. He's trying to make sure that we fully utilize the federal government space. And given the administration's present desire to bring people back into the office, which I think is the right thing to do, this amendment works towards all of those goals. Presently, I am aware of a situation in which a federal building is going to be closed and sold, and some of the current employees in that will be transferred to a commercially leased building. And I'm unable to figure out why that's a good idea when we have a federally owned building that is capable of housing those employees if it were not to be sold. And so this doesn't go to that specific piece of it, but it basically builds off the current requirement that the federal government intends to lease a building, we be notified. And this would say that in that notification, we would have information about where those employees are coming from. Are they coming from a presently owned federal building to be transferred to a commercial building? Now, that's an important piece of this total puzzle that Mr. Perry is attempting to get us to focus on, and therefore I think this would make sense as an additional requirement that the committee and the Congress be notified if there is a transfer from a federally owned building, employees being transferred from a federally owned building to a commercial lease. That's it. I would ask for an aye vote in positive.
Does anyone wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I recognize myself. I do support this amendment because it ensures that the committee receives more details in GSA's prospectus if the agency is moving from owned to lease space. With that, I'll yield back. Seeing no further speakers, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.R. 6260? Hearing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6260 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. Question is now on adoption and favorably reported of H.R. 6260 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 6260 as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House without objection. Motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Moving on, our next item for consideration is H.R. 6276, the Utilizing Space Efficiently and Improving Technologies or Use Act of 2023, and I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 6276. And without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Economic Development and Public Buildings and Emergency Management Subcommittee Chair Perry to offer his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I have an amendment in the nature of substitute at the desk.
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6276 offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and be considered as base text for the purposes of further amendment. I recognize Mr. Perry for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to offer this ANS and sponsor H.R. 6276, the Use It Act. In July, the subcommittee held a hearing based on a Government Accountability Office review of how agencies were actually not using their headquarters space here in Washington, D.C. 17 of the 24 agencies reviewed by the GAO used 25% or less of their space. One agency even admitted that if 100% of their employees showed up, they would still only use 67% of their building. This is completely unacceptable. At the time of the GAO's review, some agencies were only using 9% of their space. This bill would use similar metrics to those used by the GAO and require federal agencies to report on their actual utilization rates, setting a target utilization of not less than 60%, which again I think is overly generous, but requiring the General Service Administration to report to Congress if any agency fails to meet that standard, that low standard. Agencies will be given some time to meet the 60% standard, but if they fail to do so, they will lose their excess space. The bill specifically directs the Office of Management and Budget to submit a plan to Congress on consolidating headquarters space and selling what is not needed here in D.C., and then directs OMB and GSA to implement that plan. The bottom line is this: agencies need to bring federal workers back, but if they don't, the taxpayers should not be paying for the empty space. I agree with the mayor here in D.C. about this: bring workers back or put federal properties to better use. Empty federal buildings are an unacceptable drain to the taxpayer. I urge my colleagues to support this ANS and the underlying bill, and I yield the balance.
I now recognize Ms. Napolitano for her statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While the amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 6276 is well intended, it includes some good provisions. We must oppose its passage. The ANS 6276 directs the Office of OMB and General Services to establish standards for measuring occupancy in federal buildings. I am concerned that the bill defines occupancy as the total number of employees working in their office at least 5 days a week. Mr. Chairman, in 1994, President Bill Clinton issued a memorandum on expanding family-friendly work arrangements in the executive branch. This memo directed the heads of executive departments and the agencies to implement flexible work arrangements to create a family-friendly workplace by establishing a program to encourage and support the expansion of flexible arrangements such as job sharing, career part-time employment, alternative work schedules, and telecommuting and satellite work locations. If the sponsor of the bill wants insight into the actual number of occupants in the federal buildings, I suggest he ensure that all federal employees are counted. A full-time employee with an approved alternative work schedule is still a full-time employee. If we only count employees who sit in their chairs 5 full days per week, we may very well be missing a significant portion of the data set. The effort to count occupants in the buildings is worthwhile, but only if we ensure that all occupants, including those that have sanctioned and approved alternative work schedules, are included. Because the ANS 26276 fails to accurately count all federal employees in the GSA-owned or occupied space, I must oppose this ANS and encourage my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. I yield myself 5 minutes, and I just simply want to thank Chairman Perry for his work on this issue. We are wasting far too much taxpayer money, and this common sense bill is going to direct agencies or drive agencies to right-size their space and reduce costs. So I would urge adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no further speakers, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6276? Seeing none, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6276. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to.
I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 6276 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. Ayes appear to have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question are postponed. Moving on, the next item for consideration is H.R. 6261, the Impact of Crime on Public Buildings Usage Act of 2023. And I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 6261. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I'd like to thank our colleague from Oregon, Ms. Chavez Dreamer, for her work on this bill. H.R. 6261, the Impact of Crime on Public Building Usage Act in 2023, it does direct the Government Accountability Office to complete a study examining the impact of how crime in and around public buildings affects building usage, how workers commute to the office, and any increased cost to maintain those buildings. We saw crime rates spike across the entire country in 2020, and our downtown areas that used to be filled with workers have become ghost towns. As we work to bring employees back into the office, it's crucial that we ensure that they are not in physical danger in or around their office. I would support or urge support of the bill, and I now recognize Ms. Napolitano for her statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would support 6261, the Impact on Crime on Public Building Usage Act of 2023, which directs GAO to study and report to Congress on the effect that crime and safety concerns have on an in-person at work at federal buildings. I am concerned that the bill fails to include the Protective Service, Federal Protective Service, the FPS. The FPS is responsible for protecting federal buildings and assessing the security of federal buildings and the employees who populate them. So any analysis of security issues should include FPS. Therefore, I encourage staff, when working with GAO, to design the parameters of the study to ensure that FPS is involved. Mr. Chairman, I support the legislation and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I'm pleased to support H.R. 6261, which was introduced by the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, Ms. Chavez Dreamer of Oregon. The bill requires a Government Accountability Office study that assesses the impact of increased crime in urban and downtown areas, including drug use and homelessness on public building utilization. It's almost unimaginable. In April of this year, the Biden administration issued a memo that called for federal workers to return to the office. However, there have been various agencies encouraging workers to work remotely due to safety concerns. Again, unimaginable in America. For example, in August, the Department of Health and Human Services issued guidance to workers in their San Francisco regional office to telework for the foreseeable future, quote, due to ongoing safety issues with drug dealing and use happening on the sidewalks outside, end quote. Federal workers need to return to the office, but they need to be able to know that they're going to be safe. While poor local policing may be the cause of safety concern raised by HHS, we need to understand how increasing crime is affecting building usage and the safety of our workforce. We also need to get a better sense of what the taxpayer has to pay to keep these buildings safe due to poor local policing and the associated safety concerns. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and yield the balance.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Seeing none, are there any amendments to H.R. 6261? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting of H.R. 6261 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6241, the Federal Use It or Lose It Leases Act, or the Full Act. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 6241. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration without objection. The first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Now yield myself 5 minutes, and I do want to thank my colleague from North Carolina, Mr. Edwards, for introducing the Full Act. This bipartisan bill will strengthen the oversight and accountability of agency space usage, and the bill requires that all occupancy agreements between GSA and the tenant agencies contain provisions for monthly occupancy and utilization reports. It also requires excess tenant agency space to be returned to GSA and clarifies that the agencies with independent leasing authorities must report space usage to the authorizing committees. I would urge support of the bill and yield back. I now recognize Ms. Napolitano on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 6241, Representative Edwards' Federal Use It or Lose It Lease Act, or the Full Act, is another well-intentioned bill that I unfortunately oppose. The Full Act directs the General Service Administration to include in its occupancy agreements with federal tenants a requirement that tenant agencies must submit a report on utilization and uses of GSA. The bill requires agencies with independent leasing authority to submit an annual report on the utilization to this committee. Additionally, the bill requires federal tenants to return office space to GSA if occupancy falls below 60% for 6 months within any 1 year period. We all want federal agencies to avoid the cost of leasing unused space, but we need to have an accurate understanding of an agency's space needs. Unfortunately, this bill utilizes the same definition for occupancy as H.R. 6276, the Use It Act. The term occupancy means the total number of employees performing his or her duties in person, in office space, at least 5 days a week on a recurrent basis. As I explained during the debate on 6276, many federal employees utilize alternative work schedules and to get an accurate count of occupation and utilization rates, we must count those employees who partake in sanctioned workplace flexibility programs. And an additional concern is that the bill requires GSA federal tenants to have written procedures in place governing the return to office space to GSA of General Services. If the occupancy of federal tenant falls below 60% space utilization rate, this requirement runs counter to the recent GSA change in policy, which now directs all new occupancy agreements between GSA and federal tenants to include a non-cancellation clause to prevent agencies from returning space to GSA. Mr. Chairman, 6241 is a well-intentioned piece of legislation, but I'm afraid it will not meet the goals envisioned by its author. The failure to count all federal employees, those who sit the chair 5 days a week, and those who utilize sanctioned alternative work schedules will result in an inaccurate count of office occupancy and utilization. And telling federal agencies to return underutilized space to GSA when GSA policy now prevents agencies from returning space is confusing and unworkable. Therefore, I must oppose 6241, urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I think it's important to realize that I introduced the Federal Use It or Lose It Leases Act, or the Full Act, to bring accountability to the practice of maintaining high telework levels while maintaining expensive office leases, and to reduce wasteful government spending on office space that the federal government is not using. If you haven't heard already, a GAO report found that 17 out of 24 major agency headquarters in D.C. were less than 25% occupied, less than 25% occupied during the first quarter of 2023. Even the few agencies above 25% reported right around or below 50% occupancy. Meanwhile, taxpayers continue to pay for 100% of the office space federal employees are not using. The federal real estate portfolio has become a wasteland that is seldom reviewed. Business as usual just does not need to apply here. Leased assets cost taxpayers more than $6 billion a year, and even during the peak of telework between 2020 and 2022, federal agencies managed to spend, listen to this, more than $1 billion every year on new furnishings. It's about time we reined in an agency's ability to waste money on expensive leases while their employees refuse to show up to work, and that starts with collecting on data on occupancy. The Full Act will require federal tenants to submit an annual report on monthly occupancy to GSA and have a written procedure in place to return unused office space to GSA if it is not being used. The Full Act also requires independent leasing authorities to submit a report to this committee, our Senate counterpart, and the Congressional Committee of Jurisdiction on occupancy and space utilization. My bill seeks to equip Congress and GSA with the data that it needs to provide greater oversight of federal leases, to reduce the federal real estate footprint, and to ensure that we're maximizing every federal dollar spent on office space for agency use. I urge support of this bill, and once again, thank the chairman for this opportunity to speak in support of the Full Act.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I want to thank our colleague from North Carolina, Mr. Edwards, for his leadership on H.R. 6241, the Full Act. H.R. 6241 would direct the GSA to include language in its occupancy agreements with its tenant agencies that require those agencies to provide GSA with annual reporting of its space utilization. I mean, they simply have to know. It would also require those agreements to contain procedures for returning space to GSA if space usage or utilization falls below 60%. The Full Act would also specifically direct agencies with independent leasing authority to provide annual reports to Congress on their utilization rates. This bill ensures GSA gets what it needs from its tenant agencies in terms of data and procedures for giving up space, and makes it clear that agencies with their own leasing authority are not exempt from reporting on their space utilization. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and yield back the balance.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Seeing no one, the question is now on adoption favorably reporting of H.R. 6241 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Say Marinaro. We're going to go out of order real quick. We're going to skip 6249 and just jump to, because he's not here yet. We're going to jump to 6254, which will be the next item for consideration, the Public Buildings Accountability Act of 2023. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 6254. And without objection, That is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'd recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I do want to thank my colleague from Wisconsin, Mr. Van Orden, for introducing 6254, the Public Buildings Accountability Act of 2023. The bill requires the GAO to review the personnel structure, including staff trends, work locations, and organizational structure of the GSA's Public Building Service. This bill is going to help us get a more accurate understanding of whether federal workers are back in the office or if taxpayer dollars are being wasted on empty space. I'd urge support of this legislation, and I now yield to Ms. Napolitano for her statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support 6254, the Public Buildings Accountability Act of 2023, which directs the GAO to review administration and management of GSA's real estate programs, activities, funding, and staffing. The information and data are essential to this committee to conduct proper oversight of the agency under its jurisdiction. When this committee authorizes GSA real estate activities, we're acting solely upon information provided to us by GSA and the Office of Management and Budget. Having GAO do an independent analysis of the efficacy of GSA's operations will help this committee better evaluate GSA's authorization request. However, GAO must work with the Department of Homeland Security's Interagency Security Committee to ensure that security concerns for all employees and buildings are met and protected. I recommend that staff and GAO, as they are drafting the parameters of the study, ensure the information that could impact the security of federal employees and federal facilities is protected. I support the legislation and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Mr. Van Orden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chronic federal employee absenteeism the Biden administration has enabled has been allowing bureaucrats to play hooky, and it simply must stop. In a March roundtable, I asked the former Commissioner of Public Building Service for the GSA, Ms. Nina Albert, how many of her 15,000 employees were actually at work, and she couldn't answer that. Full 3.5 months later, fully knowing that she'd be facing this committee, I asked her the same question, and she still could not answer that question. As a troop chief in the SEAL teams, I was able to manage people on multiple continents in multiple time zones, many of which were in combat simultaneously. And I could tell you within a 10-meter circumference where those people were around the world. And I don't think it's too much to ask for the GSA to figure out where their people are, what they're doing, and when they're doing it. In the military, we call this troop to task. And if they don't know where their people are or what they're doing, it truly boggles the mind how they can keep coming back in front of this committee and asking for more money when they don't know what they're spending it on. So I'm very pleased that this committee is focusing on the legislation to help ensure that federal agencies are using the office space that they're assigned, and selling the space they're not is going to save taxpayers money. I introduced the Public Buildings Accountability Act of 2023 to enforce transparency and accountability with the public services, with building service that to do just that. H.R. 6254 will shed light on the effectiveness of the public building services staffing structure and funding with the General Services Administration by providing information to enhance the committee's ongoing oversight work to maximize the return of the federal employees to in-person work. These reports will provide greater clarity on PBS's funding needs and ensure the responsible use of hardworking Americans' taxpayers' dollars. And I want to thank the staff, both the majority and the minority, for working on this diligently. I appreciate your support very much, and with that, I yield back, sir.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I'm pleased to support H.R. 6254, which was introduced by our colleague from Wisconsin, Mr. Van Orden. As we work to pass a number of bills requiring GSA to really assess its current real estate portfolio, it is important that we make sure the public building service of the GSA is appropriately managing its staff also to lead this government-wide effort. We appreciate Mr. Van Orden's efforts, and they are worthy. I urge my colleagues to support the bill and yield the balance.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Hearing none, are there any amendments to H.R. 6254? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of and favorably reported of H.R. 6254 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. We're going to keep moving forward. So the next item of consideration is H.R. 5754, the bill to designate the United States Courthouse located at 350 West First Street, Los Angeles, California, as the Felicitas and Gonzalo Mendez United States Courthouse. And I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Public Buildings, Emergency Management, and Economic Development from further consideration of H.R. 5754, and without objection, that is so ordered. And I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself. This bill honors a couple who played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement, and it is fitting that we acknowledge the late couple by naming the courthouse in Los Angeles, California, after them. I now recognize Ms. Napolitano for her statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for Ranking Member Larson, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus for bringing this bill in front of the full committee. I especially want to thank Representative Jimmy Gomez for introducing this important legislation. I am proud to support this courthouse renaming bill as it recognizes the critical role Felicitas and Gonzalo Mendez served in the fight for civil rights in the United States. The results of fight for equality in the landmark case Mendez versus Westminster, along with 4 other families from Orange County, California, would not only end segregation in California schools, but also lay the groundwork for Brown versus Brown of education in 1954. In September this year, I stood alongside Sylvia Mendez, daughter of Felicitas and Gonzalo, as Representative Gomez marked the introduction of this bill. Sylvia, a dedicated civil rights activist, travels the country to ensure the legacies of her parents and the other 4 families are not forgotten. I am proud to have worked with my LA area colleagues in 2011, especially former colleague Lucille Roybal Allard, in advocating for construction of this much-needed courthouse in downtown Los Angeles. The Felicitas and Gonzalo Mendez U.S. Courthouse will serve as a reminder of the contributions of Latino Americans to this country, and hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Are there any other speakers on the bill? Seeing none, the question is now on the adoption of and favorably reported of H.R. 5754 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6316, the amend Title 40, United States Code, to establish an expiration date of certain committee resolutions with respect to leases or projects and for other purposes. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 6316. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to thank Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Ms. Titus, for her work on H.R. 6316, along with Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Perry. This bill sets an expiration date for committee resolutions for the General Services Administration's Capital Leasing and Improvements Program. The GSA, if the GSA fails to proceed with a project, we have authorized within 5 years, the authorization should expire and GSA should be required to return to the committee for a new approval. This is a common sense proposal, and I would urge support of the bill. I now recognize Ms. Napolitano for her statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 6316 sunsets committee resolutions approving GSA construction, alteration, repair, design, or acquisition projects after 5 years. This is an issue that's concerned TNI members on both sides of the aisle for years because GSA is not particularly forthcoming about the status and execution of projects after they have been authorized by this committee. There have been times when GSA has sat on an authorization before executing a project that was larger and more expensive than Congress has intended. If GSA cannot execute a project within 5 years, it is fair to surmise they're going back on the drawing board. And if that is the case, GSA should come back to Congress for a new authorization that represents the project it has evolved, as it has evolved. I support this legislation in previous Congresses, and I support it again today. I thank Subcommittee Ranking Member Titus for introducing legislation and Subcommittee Chairman Perry for the support. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of H.R. 6316, which was introduced by my colleague and the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Titus of Nevada. This bill prevents the General Services Administration from initiating a new construction, alteration, or repair project or awarding a lease more than 5 years after the committee's authorization. GSA should not be able to use outdated resolutions to justify projects when it is evident that the scope or need of the project may have changed over the course of the 5 years. It's obvious we've worked well on this together, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield the balance.
Are there any other speakers? Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Chairman Perry for joining me in sponsoring this important legislation. H.R. 6316 sets a 5-year expiration on committee resolutions approving GSA construction, alteration, repair, design, or acquisition projects. That means that if within 5 years of passage of the resolution, GSA has not executed the project, then the authorization is deemed expired. We all know that in today's age and technological changes, a lot can happen in 5 years. Now, this has been a concern to members of both sides of the aisle for years. Similar provisions were included in Chairman Schuster's Public Buildings Reform and Savings Act of 2016 and in Chairman Barletta's Real Reform Act of 2018. Unfortunately, neither of these was signed into law. I work with a lot of federal agencies, and it can often be difficult to obtain information, but GSA may be one of the worst. It's hard to get information about where they are in projects, what kind of activities going on, what's being constructed. We have little to no visibility in how, when, and if the project's been executed. This lack of information became apparent after GSA submitted a prospectus to build a new courthouse in Los Angeles in 2000 as part of its 2001 capital investment program. Even though there were already 2 courthouses in Los Angeles, the Judicial Conference insisted the LA courthouse complex was so short a space for judges that it was the #1 space emergency in the country. GSA submitted a prospectus to build a new courtroom totaling 700,012 gross square feet at a cost of $266 million, which this committee approved. The design of the building, however, exceeded the congressionally authorized size by 13 courtrooms and $100 million, and the scope of the project changed so often that GSA canceled it in 2006. Then in 2011, the courts and GSA announced that they'd move forward with a downsized project that wouldn't exceed the size and cost originally authorized more than 10 years earlier without giving Congress any notification. We're so concerned about this sort of action that this committee requested a GAO study of the courthouse construction, and we held a series of hearings. Although Chairman Schuster and Barletta are no longer here, their concerns, as well as longtime concerns of Chairwoman Norton, are still relevant, and that's why this legislation is necessary. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of it so the committee can ensure that GSA is being a good steward of taxpayer dollars. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Seeing no one, the question is now on adoption and favorably reporting of H.R. 6316 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to in order favorably reported to the House without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. we have 2 bills left, and then we're going to go right to our 2 recorded votes that we have so far. I don't know if we are or not. So make sure people get here. They need to be here right away because we got people that have to get out of the catch flights. So our next item for consideration is H.R. 6317, to require the administrator of the General Services Administration to submit a report describing a process for seeking public comment about the proposed changes to mandatory design standards for public buildings and for other purposes. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Committee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 6317, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself. I'd like to thank Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management, Ms. Titus, for her work on this bill. 6317 requires the GSA to revise the process to change the P11 or P100 guidance document, which mandates design and performance criteria for public buildings. The public comment period required by this bill will prevent closed-door decisions and bring much increased transparency to the process. And I would urge support of the legislation. I now yield to Mr. Larson for his statement. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill, introduced by Subcommittee Ranking Member Titus, directs the administrator of the GSA to establish a process that will enable the public to participate in the development of updates to GSA's facility standards for the public buildings service. Currently, when GSA updates sections of P100, there is no requirement to share that text with the public or to secure feedback. Compliance with these standards is mandatory when designing and constructing new federal facilities, repairing and altering existing federal buildings, and designing and constructing leased facilities that the government intends to own or has an option to purchase. Because compliance is mandatory, it's reasonable to provide an opportunity for the public to examine proposed changes and give feedback about those changes to GSA. So I want to commend my colleague from Nevada for her efforts to ensure accountability and transparency through the life cycle of all GSA construction and design projects. I support H.R. 6317 and urge my colleagues to do the same. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I'm pleased to support H.R. 6317, which was introduced by my colleague and the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Titus of Nevada. This bill adds increased transparency to the process through which GSA amends and updates the P100, which guides GSA's construction of buildings. The P100 guidance document mandates design and performance criteria for public buildings and has a significant impact on project costs. However, the only people who currently have a seat at the table when amending the P100 are those that the GSA invites, and only those. This bill ensures the process to alter the P100 is transparent and includes input from a variety of experts, not just those handpicked by the GSA. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield the balance.
Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the Ranking Member Larson and also the Chairman Perry of the subcommittee. You've heard the P100 mentioned in several of their comments. I would just say that what it is establishes design standards and criteria for the construction of new federal buildings, as well as repairs and alterations of existing buildings. The P100 is a very important document. It explains which federal laws, regulations, and standards must be applied to construction projects, which codes and standards must be followed, how first responders and emergency vehicles can access federal buildings, landscape performance requirements, as well as requirements for structural and electrical engineers to follow. As you have heard, and it's my understanding, that the guide is updated with very little public input or transparency. This bill doesn't call for a formal regulatory process, but I do think it's reasonable to expect the GSA to formally solicit best practices, input, and advice from the public when contemplating changes to these standards. And that's what this bill does. It requires GSA to establish a process for soliciting feedback from the public whenever changes to the P100 are considered. This process should include an open comment period that's publicly advertised in the Federal Register and on GSA's website, and the process should conclude with a summary of comments received during that comment period. I believe this requirement is necessary to ensure taxpayer dollars are being spent in a responsible manner. I thank you all for your support, and I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to H.R. 6317? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption and favorably reported of H.R. 6317 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and reported favorably to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Now, going back, our next item for consideration is 6249, to think differently about Emergencies Act. And I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of 6249 without objection as so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration without objection. The first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'd like to thank our colleague from New York, Mr. Molinaro, for his work on 6249. Mr. Molinaro has been an advocate for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This bill requires FEMA to submit a report to Congress that outlines the assistance and resources available to those with intellectual and developmental disabilities and directs the GAO to review available assistance to help identify those gaps. Disasters are difficult for everyone, but it's important that we clearly understand what is available and how best we can help those who have a limited ability to react or respond to disasters on their own. I would urge support of this bill and yield back and recognize Mr. Larson for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Support this legislation that Representative Molinaro introduced along with Ranking Member Titus, Representative Carbajal, and Congressman Norton. It's vital all Americans have equal access to the resources to recover from disasters. However, census data released this year concluded individuals with disabilities are far more likely to face major hardships, including displacement from their homes after a disaster. Such outcomes are unacceptable, and the federal government must work with urgency to address this inequity. This legislation will equip Congress with the knowledge required to improve outcomes for individuals with disabilities. It requires the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Government Accountability Office to review and report on assistance available to individuals with disabilities before and after disasters. There's much needed information as approximately 13% of Americans, 42.5 million people, live with a disability, and the Americans with Disabilities Act requires the federal government provide these individuals with equal access to disaster-related programs. Adapting emergency management plans and programs to suit the needs of individuals with disabilities is necessary to sustain their rights, well-being, and give them equal access to programs that most of us take for granted. I'm also pleased this legislation places a particular emphasis on individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities, since their needs have been overlooked in existing federal disaster guidance documents. I want to thank the bipartisan group of committee members for offering this legislation and urge its adoption. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Molinaro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your support and leadership on this particular legislation. I want to thank the ranking member and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for joining in sponsorship. As was noted, the Think Differently About Emergencies Act is meant to address and ensure Americans with intellectual, developmental, and physical disabilities, along with their families, have the access to resources they need to safely recover after a major disaster. Studies do show that individuals with intellectual, physical, and developmental disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or be critically injured during disasters across the country. As a former volunteer firefighter myself and 12 years in emergency management, I know, as my colleagues do, that we need an emergency response system that not only prepares for disasters, but also is equipped to support the unique needs of individuals with disabilities, their caregivers, and their families. The Think Differently About Emergencies Act ensures no one is left behind and that our emergency response system is prepared to support those of every ability. I urge my colleagues' support, and I yield back.
Ms. Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have heard often in this committee that today's disasters are more frequent, they cause more damage, and they have longer recovery time. Through my role as ranking member of the subcommittee, excuse me, that oversees FEMA and as a co-founder of the Disaster Equity and Building Resilience Caucus, I've learned, unfortunately, that in the aftermath of these events, individuals with disabilities find themselves at increased risk of institutionalization, risk of injury, risk of death, oftentimes because they don't know what resources are available to them or how to access those resources. I'm proud to have joined Representative Molinaro in introducing the Think Differently About Emergencies Act, which will help identify needed improvements to the emergency management landscape so we can ensure that, as he said, no one gets left behind in the wake of a major disaster. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and I thank you and yield back.
Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to commend the gentleman from New York for this timely piece of legislation. I, on the Homeland Security Committee, do some of the same work parallelly on the emergency response and recovery. And so I'm just, as a person that was in special needs education for 10 years, I've always tried to dedicate myself to this marginalized population too. So I want to commend the gentleman for this timely legislation. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on H.R. 6249? Seeing none, are there any amendments to H.R. 6249? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 6249 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. So we have two recorded votes, and after consulting with ranking member, we're going to take up those two requested votes at the December markup. I appreciate everyone that stayed here to do their job, and it's frustrating to me that some decided to leave. But with that, we will take them up in December. I now recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As well, I want to thank the members on my side of the aisle who responded to my admonition on the floor to get here for the votes that we're going to take. However, there is an attendance issue, and in the interest of the bipartisanship and fairness that we have tried to accord each other throughout this year, in honor of that theme, I agreed that we would agree to having the votes, the recorded votes done at a future markup when we know that everyone can be here. So I want to thank folks for coming out. Look at all you guys, and the word got out. We're just trying to be nice once in a while. And besides that, it's also been a rough 10 weeks, 12 weeks. And I will note that absence makes the heart grow fonder. The other side is, how can I miss you all if you won't go away? So we want you to go away for a while. We all can go back in about 10 days and like each other again. So with that, I yield back.
So with that, I hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving, and thank you for participating in today's markup. I'd ask unanimous consent that each measure ordered today will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted without objection that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the measures ordered reported favorably today to reflect the actions of the committee, and without objection that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman or his designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or any similar measure without objection that is so ordered. And I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, have the authority to strike or revise any provision of the measures ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or that would cause the bill to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 cut-go point of order. Without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members of the committee have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views on the legislation adopted today, and without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, I note the presence of a quorum for actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure has completed its business, and the committee is now adjourned.
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear you.